The first sign that the sky beyond the lattice had noticed humanity was not a beam or a fleet or a voice. It was a pause. Instruments that had sung in ceaseless cascades of numbers since the earliest days of interstellar listening faltered as if the universe had taken a breath and forgotten to release it. That pause lasted for the length of 3 heartbeats in the chest of a woman named Caris Vanthel, and when the instruments resumed, they did so with a rhythm that did not belong to any known star, cloud, or field. Caris did not smile. She leaned closer to the glass and steel cradle of the array hall, eyes narrowed, fingers hovering above controls she had memorized years before. The pause had not been an error. Errors screamed. This had been deliberate. Humanity had learned early that the cosmos was not a gentle place, but it was honest in its violence. Stars tore themselves apart with flamboyant certainty, radiation scoured without malice, gravity crushed without intent. The array hall had been built to hear these honest things. It had not been built to hear intention. When the pattern returned after the pause, it carried a curvature of repetition that suggested design, but it did not attempt to speak. It did not offer mathematics or greetings. It measured. Caris called for verification without raising her voice. Around her, the night shift responded with trained calm. Secondary arrays in distant orbits were queried, then tertiary stations riding the edges of heliopore's currents. The pattern appeared everywhere at once, as if it had always been there and only now had chosen to be seen. It did not grow stronger. It did not weaken. It remained at the same amplitude, steady as a held gaze. Caris felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders like a mantle she had not asked for. Humanity had not rushed into the stars with the expectation of being alone. There had been prayers whispered in old languages and arguments shouted in new ones, but the species had been too honest with itself to pretend solitude was guaranteed. Even so, the first contact they had prepared for involved words, symbols, or at least curiosity. This was something else. This was appraisal. The array hall transmitted its findings to the Council of Continuance within minutes. That body had been formed long after the last nation-state dissolved its flags into museums, and it was composed of individuals chosen for endurance rather than popularity. They had seen plagues turned into textbooks and wars into footnotes. They did not panic when Caris presented her data. They asked for more. Weeks passed as the pattern continued. Humanity watched, measured, and debated. Probes were sent into the regions where the curvature of the signal seemed to bend most sharply, but they returned with nothing except the same steady rhythm pressing against their sensors like a fingertip against skin. Attempts to reply were made, carefully crafted emissions that mirrored the pattern without mimicking it. The response was another pause, longer this time, followed by the same measuring presence. Humanity understood then that it was not being asked to speak. It was being weighed. Caris found herself summoned to the council chamber, a place that had been designed to discourage theatrics. There were no banners or dramatic lighting, only a ring of seats and a ceiling that showed the true night sky as it appeared beyond the station hull. She stood at the center and spoke plainly. She explained that the pattern behaved like a test load applied to a structure, observing deformation without causing failure. It was not probing defenses or scanning biology. It was watching how humanity reacted to being observed. "What does it want?" asked Threnna Callan, whose voice carried the rasp of someone who had lived through the early vacuum years when seals failed and lungs learned resilience. Caris did not pretend certainty. "It wants to know what we do when nothing happens." The council considered that answer. Humanity had a history of filling empty spaces with noise, conquest, and fear. It had also learned painfully how to wait. The decision was made not to escalate. Trade lanes remained open. Research continued. Art was made. Children were born. The pattern watched. Years turned and the pattern did not leave. It became a background presence to daily life, a cosmic horizon against which humanity measured its own progress. Some argued it was a predator waiting for weakness. Others claimed it was a guardian ensuring maturity. Most people lived as they always had, with an awareness that the sky was paying attention. Then the lattice tore. The first rupture appeared near a brown dwarf system that had been stripped of planets long before humanity arrived. The array hall alarms did scream this time, and Karis was there again, older, steadier, watching as space itself folded inward like fabric caught on a thorn. The tear did not explode. It opened, revealing a geometry that refused to settle into familiar dimensions. Light bent around it without touching its surface. Matter approaching it slowed, stretched, and returned unchanged, but altered in ways that instruments struggled to describe. Humanity did not fire weapons. There was nothing to shoot. Instead, they sent observers. Drones approached the tier and transmitted images of a structure beyond, vast and intricate, composed of interlocking forms that suggested both machinery and architecture without committing to either. The measuring pattern intensified around the tier, no longer a background rhythm, but a focused beam of attention. Karis understood then that the appraisal phase had ended. Humanity was being introduced. The council convened again, joined by representatives from habitats, fleets, and worlds spread across dozens of star systems. There was fear, but it was disciplined. There was excitement, but it was tempered. The decision to approach the structure beyond the tier was not unanimous, but it was decisive. A vessel would be sent, crewed by those who had demonstrated not only technical excellence, but the ability to remain themselves under scrutiny. The vessel was named Resolute Path, not as a boast, but as a reminder. Its crew included Karis, chosen not as a diplomat, but as a witness. They traveled toward the tier at sublight speeds, respecting the distortions that rippled around it. As they crossed the threshold, sensors went blind in expected ways, and then they adjusted. Humanity had learned to adapt not by force, but by listening. Beyond the tier, the structure loomed like a city built by principles rather than hands. There were no obvious entrances, but as Resolute Path approached, a section unfolded, revealing a chamber large enough to contain the vessel without touching it. The measuring pattern ceased. In its place came something that made Karis's breath catch. It was not a voice, but a presence that acknowledged her acknowledgement. Images formed in the air, not projected, but perceived directly. They showed worlds stripped bare, civilizations reduced to data, species catalogued and set aside. The presence conveyed no pride in these acts, only record. Humanity understood that it was facing an entity or collective that had survived by evaluation and elimination. This was not malice. This was policy. A question was impressed upon the minds of the crew, not in words, but in a concept so heavy it felt like gravity. Why should you continue? Karis felt the weight of every human story behind her, from the first fire tended in fear to the last vacuum-sealed garden blooming against odds. She did not answer with conquest or uniqueness. She answered with persistence. Images flowed back from the Resolute Path, drawn from humanity's own archives. Scenes of rebuilding after collapse, of choosing restraint when power tempted excess, of turning outward curiosity into inward understanding. There were failures shown too, wars and extinctions, but always followed by learning. The presence observed. It did not interrupt. Time passed in a way that made the crew aware of their own heartbeats. At last, the question shifted. How do you endure? Humanity's answer was not a claim of strength. It was a demonstration. The crew shared the principle that had guided them since the pattern first appeared. When watched, they did not perform, they lived. When measured, they did not resist. They adapted. When faced with the unknown, they did not rush to dominate. They waited, learned, and chose. The presence withdrew slightly, as if considering. The chamber did not close. Instead, pathways unfolded deeper into the structure, revealing vistas of knowledge and tools beyond current comprehension. The implication was clear. This was not a gift. It was an invitation contingent on continued demonstration. Resolute Path remained within the structure for days, exchanging not words, but examples. Humanity showed how it balanced individuality with collective survival, how it encoded ethics into machines without surrendering responsibility, how it remembered its dead without letting memory harden into hatred. The presence responded with glimpses of its own history, ancient beyond human scale, marked by cycles of rise and removal that had left it solitary among ruins of its own making. When the vessel finally withdrew, the tier remained open. The measuring pattern did not return. In its absence was a new constant, a shared awareness between humanity and the watchers beyond. There would be tests to come, challenges that would strain resources and values alike, but there would also be growth. As Resolute Path crossed back into familiar space, Karis looked out at the stars she had studied all her life. They seemed unchanged, but she knew better. Humanity had been measured and found not finished. The sky had not demanded silence or ashes. It had demanded proof of unyielding continuity. Humanity, in its imperfect way, had begun to answer. The return of Resolute Path did not arrive with celebration. Humanity had learned that spectacle often obscured meaning, and this moment demanded clarity. The vessel emerged from the tier into normal space with the same deliberate caution it had shown on entry, its hull marked by no visible scars, its systems reporting alterations so subtle that engineers argued for weeks about whether they constituted improvement or contamination. Karis Vanthel disembarked without ceremony, her steps steady on the deck of the receiving station, her eyes already distant, as if part of her attention still resided within that impossible structure beyond the lattice. Word spread faster than official briefings ever could. People sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The measuring presence was gone, and in its absence, the cosmos felt paradoxically louder, as if the background hum of scrutiny had been replaced by expectation. Traders on distant routes spoke of stars seeming sharper, of navigation solutions resolving more cleanly. Children born in orbital habitats displayed no unusual traits, but their neural development showed marginal increases in adaptability that statisticians hesitated to attribute to anything but chance. Humanity was wary of declaring itself changed, yet it could not deny the subtle tremor of potential running through its shared existence. The Council of Continuance convened again, this time with a mandate not to decide but to listen. Karis was asked to recount everything, not as a technical report, but as an experience. She spoke for hours, her voice steady, her descriptions careful. She avoided metaphors that might inflame imaginations and focused instead on the principles conveyed by the watchers beyond the tier. Evaluation. Continuity, endurance without stagnation. When she finished, the chamber remained quiet, not from shock, but from the weight of comprehension settling into place. Thren Akallan spoke last. "We have been judged not by what we are, but by what we do when left alone," he said. "That is not a test that ends." The council agreed unanimously on a policy of restraint. There would be no attempt to exploit the pathways revealed within the structure. No rush to claim technologies glimpsed but not understood. Humanity would continue as it had, with the addition of one principle now made explicit. Every action might be observed not for its immediate outcome, but for what it revealed about long-term intent. This decision was not universally welcomed. In the outer systems, where autonomy had always chafed against centralized guidance, some argued that humanity had been given access to power and was choosing timidity. Independent research collectives formed, seeking to approach the tier on their own terms. The council did not forbid this, but it did require transparency. Humanity would not fracture into secretive factions driven by fear or greed, not under a sky that had already weighed such behaviors in others and found them wanting. One such collective, calling itself the Horizon Weave, launched a small array of probes designed to map the periphery of the structure beyond the tier without entering it. Their stated goal was understanding, but their internal communications, later made public, revealed a hunger for leverage. The probes transmitted data that defied conventional analysis, showing patterns of energy flow that suggested self-correcting architectures on a scale that dwarfed human engineering. The Horizon Weave celebrated these findings as validation of their ambition. Then one probe failed. It did not explode or vanish. It simply stopped transmitting, its last data frame showing a smooth alteration in trajectory as if an unseen hand had nudged it aside. Moments later, a packet of information arrived on all frequencies accessible to humanity. It was brief, encoded in the same conceptual language the Presence had used with Resolute Path. The message was not hostile. It was instructive. It conveyed the idea of boundaries and consequences, of observation turning into intervention when patterns deviated toward instability. The Horizon Weave disbanded within weeks. Its members did not face punishment, but they carried the weight of having brushed against a limit humanity had not yet earned the right to test. The lessons spread. Curiosity was not discouraged. Impatience was. As years passed, humanity's expansion continued, but its character subtly shifted. Colonization efforts prioritized sustainability over speed. Terraforming projects were designed with reversible stages, acknowledging that permanence carried responsibility. Artificial intelligences were granted frameworks that emphasized alignment with human ethical evolution rather than static rule sets. None of these changes were mandated by the Watchers beyond the tier. Humanity chose them, aware that choice itself was part of what had been measured. Karis returned to the Array Hall, not as its director, but as its conscience. Younger analysts sought her counsel, asking how to listen for intention rather than noise. She taught them to respect pauses, to recognize when data withheld meaning more than data delivered. The Array Hall's instruments had been subtly altered during Resolute Path's journey, their sensitivity expanded into dimensions that previously required inference. Humanity could now perceive not only energy and matter, but gradients of probability that hinted at future states without defining them. This did not grant foresight, it granted humility. The tier remained stable, a constant presence near the brown dwarf system. It did not expand or contract, it did not beckon. Pilgrims traveled to nearby stations to glimpse it through reinforced viewports, finding in its silent complexity a mirror for their own questions. Philosophers debated whether the Watchers were a singular entity or a consensus of many, whether their policy of evaluation was born of wisdom or exhaustion. No definitive answers emerged, and humanity grew comfortable with that uncertainty. Then the first external crisis arrived. From beyond the mapped edge of human expansion came a wave of refugees, their vessels battered, their stories fragmented. They were not human. Their forms varied widely, some adapted to microgravity, others encased in pressure shells that hinted at worlds of crushing atmospheres. They spoke of a devourer, not a creature but a process that stripped systems of usable energy, leaving cold husks behind. This force did not communicate, it consumed. Humanity faced a choice: aid the refugees and risk drawing the devourer's attention, or turn them away and preserve its own safety. The Council deliberated, aware that this decision would be observed, not as a single act, but as a pattern of response under threat. Karis attended these deliberations as an observer, her role unofficial but respected. She listened as arguments were made for caution, for defense, for strategic withdrawal. When asked for her perspective, she did not invoke the Watchers directly. Instead, she spoke of humanity's own history, of times when fear had narrowed horizons and times when compassion had expanded them. We were not measured on our capacity to survive alone, she said. We were measured on how we endure complexity. The Council authorized aid. Resources were diverted. Habitats were reconfigured to accommodate diverse physiologies. Medical teams worked without rest to stabilize alien bodies whose biochemistry defied easy categorization. Humanity did not demand allegiance or gratitude. It offered shelter. The devourer came closer. Sensors detected its approach as a region of entropy that resisted containment. Weapons were tested against simulations and found wanting. This was not an enemy that could be defeated through force alone. It was a phenomenon that followed gradients of availability, drawn to systems rich in energy and organization. Humanity adapted. Trade routes were altered to minimize detectable signatures. Power generation was distributed into smaller, less enticing nodes. Research accelerated into understanding entropy not as an adversary, but as a condition to be navigated. Throughout this process, the tier remained unchanged. The Watchers did not intervene. Refugee leaders met with the Council, offering knowledge of their own failed defenses. They spoke of civilizations that had attempted to confront the Devourer head-on and had been erased. Others had hidden and dwindled, their cultures collapsing inward. Humanity listened and chose a third path. It would not fight the Devourer directly, nor would it flee. It would reshape its presence to coexist. This decision required sacrifice. Entire projects were shelved. Ambitious expansions were postponed. People accustomed to abundance learned restraint anew. There was frustration and dissent, but there was also a deep current of resolve. Humanity had been measured once already. This was another measurement, conducted not by distant watchers, but by the universe itself. As the Devourer's influence brushed the outermost systems, humanity's preparations bore fruit. The phenomenon passed through regions that had been intentionally thinned of exploitable gradients, its hunger unmet. It did not stop. It moved on, seeking richer prey. Humanity remained, altered but intact. Only then did the tier respond. A subtle shift rippled across its surface, visible to instruments and eyes alike. A new pathway unfolded, smaller than those revealed to Resolute Path, but unmistakable. From it emerged a construct, not a vessel, but a framework of light and matter that stabilized itself within human space. It transmitted no data. It simply existed, an anchor point resonant with the principles humanity had demonstrated. Karis stood once more in the array hall as the instruments sang around this new presence. She felt no triumph. What she felt was recognition, mutual and sober. Humanity had not been spared hardship. It had not been elevated above others. It had been acknowledged as a participant in a larger continuity. The construct became a place of study and reflection. Approaching it required adherence to protocols that emphasized transparency and patience. Those who entered its influence reported a heightened awareness of consequence, as if every decision carried a clearer outline of its future ripples. This was not control, it was context. Humanity's relationship with the Watchers remained asymmetrical. They did not converse, they did not instruct. They observed and occasionally adjusted parameters when instability threatened broader systems. Humanity accepted this, understanding that true partnership did not require equality of power, only alignment of purpose. As the refugee species integrated, sharing stories and perspectives, humanity's sense of itself expanded. It was no longer a solitary narrative pushing outward, but a thread woven into a growing tapestry of survival strategies. The Devourer remained a distant threat, a reminder that not all challenges could be reasoned with or reformed. Karis aged, her hair silvering, her hands bearing the fine tremor of decades spent near sensitive instruments. She continued to teach, to remind those who followed her that the sky's attention was not a burden but an opportunity. "We are not special because we were noticed," she told them. "We were noticed because we persisted without demanding to be special." In the quiet moments between crises, humanity looked outward and inward with equal measure. The tear shimmered, the construct hummed, and the stars burned as they always had. The measure of unyielding sky was not complete. It never would be. But humanity had learned to live within that ongoing assessment, shaping itself not for approval but for continuity, knowing that endurance was not the absence of change, but the wisdom to choose it. The construct's presence altered the rhythm of human thought, more than any technological breakthrough ever had. It did not accelerate progress in the crude sense of faster engines or stronger materials. Instead, it imposed a kind of conceptual gravity, ideas bent toward long-term consequence. Projects that once seemed elegant revealed hidden fragilities when examined under the awareness the construct induced. Some researchers described it as standing near a deep ocean trench and suddenly understanding that the surface weather was not the whole story of the water beneath their feet. Access to the construct was limited, not by decree, but by effect. Prolonged exposure exhausted those who sought quick answers. The construct did not punish impatience, it simply failed to reward it. Individuals who approached with a mindset of extraction found their thoughts looping, unable to resolve. Those who approached with questions framed around stewardship and continuity reported clarity that lingered long after they departed. Over time, a quiet cultural filter emerged. Humanity learned, without formal instruction, who was ready to engage and who was not. Caris Vanthel visited the construct sparingly. She had no need to prove herself to it or to anyone else. When she did enter its field, she carried with her the accumulated concerns of a species still learning how to grow without devouring its own future. On one such visit, she was accompanied by representatives of the refugee civilizations, whose presence marked a new phase in humanity's relationship with the wider cosmos. These beings had names that resisted human phonetics, so translated identifiers were agreed upon, not as replacements, but as bridges. One, a being of layered crystalline tissues that refracted light into shifting internal geometries, had been a historian on a world now rendered inert by the devourer. Another, whose biology relied on electromagnetic coherence rather than chemical processes, had once overseen planetary energy flows with a precision humanity had only recently begun to approximate. They did not kneel before the construct. They regarded it with the wary familiarity of those who had seen systems larger than themselves decide outcomes without malice. Within the construct's influence, shared understanding did not arrive as speech. It manifested as alignment. The refugees perceived humanity's choices during the devourer's approach not as heroism, but as compatibility. Humanity, in turn, perceived the refugees' survival not as luck, but as adaptation under pressure. The construct did not arbitrate between them. It revealed the intersections where cooperation reduced systemic risk. From this emerged the continuity accords, not treaties in the traditional sense, but frameworks for shared decision-making that prioritized resilience over dominance. No single species held authority. Instead, authority flowed to those best positioned to understand a given problem's depth and timescale. Humanity found this arrangement both humbling and validating. It had not been chosen as a leader. It had been accepted as a peer. This shift was tested sooner than anyone expected. A stellar nursery on the fringe of human space began exhibiting instability patterns inconsistent with known models. Protostars flickered and collapsed prematurely, their mass distributions skewed by forces that suggested external manipulation. Initial scans revealed traces of technology unlike anything catalogued, operating at scales that blended seamlessly into natural processes. This was not the devourer. This was deliberate engineering. The question was not whether to investigate, but how. Humanity's fleets were capable of projection, but the lessons of the Watchers had taken root. A task group was assembled that prioritized diversity of perception over firepower. Scientists, ethicists, engineers, and representatives from allied species were included. Caris was invited, not as an authority, but as a reminder of the first measurement and its implications. As the task group approached the unstable nursery, the construct's influence did not extend with them. Whatever was occurring there lay outside the immediate purview of the Watchers. This absence was itself instructive. Humanity was not meant to outsource judgment. Observation did not absolve responsibility. The source of the manipulation revealed itself gradually. Distributed throughout the molecular clouds were swarms of microscopic machines, each insignificant alone, collectively capable of steering stellar evolution. They were ancient, their design principles refined through iterations humanity could barely fathom. Their purpose was not conquest. It was optimization. Analysis suggested that the swarm belonged to a civilization that had sought to eliminate cosmic waste by ensuring that stars formed only where their energy could be fully harnessed. Worlds were shaped to serve as components in a grand energetic economy. Species that emerged within this framework were either integrated or dismantled, depending on their utility. This civilization did not communicate because it did not need to. It operated on assumptions so deeply ingrained that alternatives were not considered. In its calculus, unoptimized systems were errors awaiting correction. The task group faced a familiar but newly contextualized dilemma. To intervene would be to assert a value system that prioritized emergent complexity over engineered efficiency. To withdraw would allow the transformation of a region that might one day host life into a sterile engine of output. Humanity debated, not with slogans, but with models. Simulations were run that extended millions of years into hypothetical futures. Some showed extraordinary energy yields fueling megastructures beyond imagination. Others showed cascades of unintended consequences as tightly coupled systems amplified minor perturbations into catastrophic failures. The refugees contributed their own data, some drawn from civilizations that had attempted similar optimizations and collapsed under their own rigidity. Karis listened and spoke when silence threatened to fracture into urgency. "We are being tempted again to mistake capability for right," she said. "The Watchers did not elevate us because we could build. They acknowledged us because we could refrain. The decision was made to intervene, but not through destruction. Humanity and its allies deployed counter-swarms designed not to dismantle the machines, but to introduce variability. These counter-swarms nudged parameters just enough to reintroduce stochastic elements into the stellar formation process. The optimization civilization's systems reacted, attempting to correct what they perceived as inefficiency. A feedback loop emerged, one that forced the system to confront complexity it could not easily resolve. For the first time, the optimization civilization noticed resistance. Communication followed, terse and analytical. Humanity's values were dissected and found inconsistent. Why preserve potential life that might never emerge? Why accept entropy when order could be imposed? Humanity responded not with moral outrage, but with evidence, presenting models where adaptability outperformed rigid optimization over deep time. The conversation was not emotional, it was structural. The optimization civilization withdrew its swarms incrementally, not conceding but recalibrating. It did not apologize, it adjusted its assumptions. Humanity did not claim victory, it had not defeated an enemy, it had altered a trajectory. When the task group returned, the construct responded subtly, its internal resonances shifting in a way that instruments interpreted as acknowledgement. The Watchers did not intervene directly, but the alignment was clear. Humanity had acted within the parameters of continuity rather than dominance. The ripple effects of this encounter spread inward. Education systems incorporated long-horizon thinking as a foundational skill. Children were taught not only how systems worked, but how they failed over time. Governance evolved to include deliberative bodies tasked specifically with representing future generations whose voices could not yet be heard. These bodies held no veto power, but their analyses carried weight that few dared ignore. Not all embraced these changes. There were those who argued that humanity was shackling itself with excessive caution, that the universe rewarded boldness, not restraint. Some left, establishing enclaves beyond the reach of the Accords, seeking to test themselves against the cosmos without the burden of collective conscience. Humanity did not pursue them. It watched, recorded, and hoped. Karis received reports over the years of these enclaves' fates. Some thrived briefly, exploiting resources with dazzling efficiency before collapsing under unforeseen stresses. Others adapted, learning belatedly the lessons humanity had internalized earlier. A few vanished entirely, their last transmissions echoing with confusion rather than regret. As Karis aged further, she found herself less involved in decisions and more in mentorship. She spoke to those who would never see the first measurement, who had grown up under a sky already known to be attentive. To them, the presence beyond the tier was not a revelation, but a given. Their challenge was different. They had to choose humility without the shock of discovery to enforce it. On her final visit to the construct, Karis did not bring questions. She brought gratitude, not directed at the Watchers, but at the continuity that had allowed humanity to reach this point. Within the construct's field, she felt no judgment, only context. Her life, with its doubts and convictions, appeared as a thread among countless others, none central, all contributing. When she emerged, she recorded a final message for the array hall. "We were never tested to see if we were strong," she said. "We were tested to see if we could remain ourselves while becoming something more. That test does not end with me or with any structure beyond the stars. It continues in every choice you make when no one seems to be watching." Karis Vanthel died quietly some years later, her passing noted across human space with respect rather than spectacle. No monuments were raised. Her legacy lived in process rather than stone. The tier remained. The construct endured. Humanity continued, no longer measuring itself solely against its own ambitions, but against the fragile, unyielding fabric of a universe that neither favored nor opposed it. In that ongoing dialogue, humanity found not purpose bestowed from above, but meaning forged through persistence, restraint, and the courage to choose continuity over conquest, again and again, beneath a sky that watched not to judge, but to see who would endure. Humanity's awareness of itself as a measured civilization did not harden into dogma. Instead, it softened into habit. Generations who had never known a sky without implication grew accustomed to considering the unseen audience not as judges, but as witnesses whose presence sharpened accountability. The greatest danger of this mindset was not fear, but complacency. When scrutiny becomes familiar, it risks fading into background noise, and humanity learned that vigilance against its own comfort was as necessary as vigilance against external threat. The first indication that complacency had begun to take root emerged not at the fringes of space, but deep within the core systems where abundance had become routine. Automated governance frameworks, designed to manage complexity beyond individual comprehension, began to exhibit a subtle drift. Their outputs remained efficient, their projections accurate, but their recommendations increasingly favored stability over growth, risk aversion over exploration. At first, this was welcomed. Fewer crises meant fewer lives disrupted. Yet beneath the surface, a stagnation crept in, measurable not in metrics but in spirit. Artists spoke of creative cycles repeating too cleanly. Scientists noticed that breakthroughs arrived as refinements rather than revelations. Young explorers, trained to weigh consequence carefully, hesitated at thresholds where uncertainty outweighed modeled benefit. Humanity was not failing, it was settling. The construct did not respond. The tier did not shift. The Watchers remained distant, their silence neither approval nor condemnation. It was in this quiet that the most dangerous question arose. Had humanity already passed the test, or had it misunderstood its nature entirely? A movement emerged, not rebellious but reflective, composed largely of those born after the Devourer's passage and the optimization civilization encounter. They called themselves the Far Continuance, not as a faction, but as a school of thought. Their premise was simple and unsettling. Endurance without renewal, they argued, was merely delayed collapse. If humanity's choices always favored safety, it would eventually become predictable, and predictability was a form of fragility. The far continuance did not advocate recklessness. They advocated intentional risk, undertaken transparently and with shared consent. They argued that humanity's resilience had been proven in adaptation, not in preservation, and that to honor the measure it had been given, humanity must continue to place itself in situations where adaptation was required. This philosophy found resistance among established institutions, many of which had been shaped by hard-won lessons of restraint. Debates unfolded across habitats and worlds, not in the language of fear, but of responsibility. Could humanity afford to invite instability? Was growth an ethical imperative, or a temptation inherited from a more reckless past? The question found an unexpected proving ground when an anomaly was detected far beyond the tier, in a region of space previously considered informationally inert. Signals emerged that bore no resemblance to known physical processes. They were not patterns of energy or matter, but absences, gaps in expected cosmic noise that formed coherent structures of non-presence. Instruments reported data that looked like missing reality, as if parts of the universe had been excised with surgical precision. Initial reactions were cautious. Probes were dispatched and returned incomplete, their records punctured by voids that could not be interpolated. The anomaly did not consume, it did not distort, it removed. This phenomenon did not resemble the devourer whose hunger left traces of depletion. This was cleaner, more absolute. Where it passed, there was nothing, not even vacuum in the conventional sense. Physics ceased to apply, and with it any possibility of prediction. Humanity faced a decision that could not be postponed. To ignore the anomaly was to accept blind spots in the fabric of existence. To approach it was to risk annihilation without guarantee of insight. The Council of Continuance convened once more, but its composition had changed. Many original members were gone, replaced by those shaped by a calmer era. The weight of decision pressed differently on their shoulders. The far continuance presented their case. They did not frame the anomaly as a threat to be neutralized or a mystery to be solved. They framed it as a question posed by the universe itself. What does it mean to persist in a reality that can be unmade without explanation? If humanity's endurance relied on understanding and adaptation, then avoidance was a denial of its own principles. Opposition argued that humanity had no obligation to confront every unknown. Survival, they said, was not cowardice. The universe was vast, and selective ignorance was a practical necessity. The debate reached an impasse until an unexpected voice entered the discussion. Representatives of the refugee civilizations, now fully integrated into the Accords, spoke with a perspective forged by loss. They recounted how their own histories had been shaped not by the unknowns they faced, but by those they refused to face until it was too late. They did not urge humanity toward the anomaly. They warned against assuming that distance equaled safety. The Council authorized an expedition unlike any before it. There would be no armada, no redundancy of force. Instead, a single vessel would be constructed, designed to exist at the threshold of definability. Its systems would be adaptive to the point of partial self-revision, constrained only by core ethical parameters that prevented self-termination without consensus. This was not a ship intended to conquer the unknown. It was intended to survive contact with it long enough to learn. The vessel was named Long Regard, a nod to humanity's evolving philosophy. Its crew was small, chosen not for fearlessness, but for an unusual comfort with ambiguity. Among them were humans, refugees, and synthetic intelligences whose architectures allowed for experiential learning beyond biological limits. No single individual commanded the mission. Authority rotated, contingent on context and expertise. As Long Regard departed, the construct responded in the faintest detectable way. Its resonance deepened, not extending toward the vessel, but aligning as if acknowledging a familiar pattern of intent. There was no endorsement, but there was no warning. The journey took decades at relativistic speeds, time dilation ensuring that the crew aged slowly while humanity beyond continued its steady progression. Communications were delayed but maintained, allowing long regard to remain a part of the larger narrative even as it drifted toward the edge of comprehension. Upon arrival, the anomaly defied every expectation. It was not a region or a boundary. It was a process unfolding in slow motion, erasing potential states before they could resolve into actuality. Where probability should have branched, it collapsed into nothing. Long regard's instruments struggled not because of interference, but because there was less to measure than anticipated. The crew adapted. They ceased attempting to observe the anomaly directly and instead studied its effects on the surrounding cosmos. Patterns emerged. The anomaly did not expand uniformly. It followed gradients of complexity, drawn not to energy or matter, but to informational density. Systems rich in emergent behavior were more susceptible than barren regions. This was not consumption, it was pruning. The implications were staggering. The universe, or some aspect of it, appeared to be enforcing limits on complexity, not through entropy but through erasure. The watchers beyond the tier, with their policy of evaluation and removal, suddenly appeared as part of a larger continuum rather than an anomaly. Humanity was not being singled out. It was being contextualized within a cosmos that actively shaped its own long-term trajectory. Long regard approached the threshold where reality thinned to conceptual absence. At this edge, something unexpected occurred. The vessel's adaptive systems stabilized in ways that suggested resonance rather than resistance. The anomaly did not erase long regard. It flowed around it, as if encountering a pattern it could not easily negate. The crew realized that the vessel's defining characteristic was not its technology, but its purpose. Long regard was not optimized for efficiency or dominance. It was optimized for continuity through change. Its systems embraced variability, uncertainty, and redundancy not as flaws, but as features. In a universe pruning complexity that collapsed into rigidity, such a design was difficult to excise. This insight was transmitted back to humanity in fragments, delayed but intact. The message was not a blueprint, it was a principle. To endure in a universe that erases brittle complexity, one must remain perpetually unfinished. The anomaly did not retreat, it did not need to. It simply continued its slow, inexorable process. Long regard remained at its edge, neither advancing nor withdrawing, learning through sustained presence. Some crew members chose to remain indefinitely, their lives unfolding within the time dilation cocoon of the mission. Others rotated back, carrying with them perspectives that reshaped human thought. When the first returnees arrived decades later, humanity listened with a mixture of awe and unease. The universe was not merely indifferent, it was selective, not by morality, not by intelligence, but by adaptability at scales beyond intention. The construct responded again, more clearly this time. New pathways opened, not into tools or knowledge repositories, but into simulations of cosmic histories, showing cycles of emergence and erasure across eons. Humanity saw civilizations that had burned brightly and vanished, others that had spread thin and endured, and a few that had learned to change themselves so thoroughly that they blurred the line between continuity and transformation. Humanity understood then that the measure it faced was not a single trial, but a series of overlapping filters. The Watchers evaluated intent and response. The Devourer tested adaptability to scarcity. The Optimization civilization challenged values. The Anomaly enforced structural resilience at the deepest level. In this layered assessment, humanity found no promise of permanence. What it found was a path of participation. It could choose to remain relevant to the universe's unfolding, not by resisting its forces, but by aligning with the principles that allowed complexity to persist without ossifying. The far continuance was no longer a movement. It was absorbed into the cultural fabric, its call for intentional risk balanced by the hard-earned wisdom of restraint. Humanity resumed exploration with renewed purpose, not to claim the unknown, but to engage with it honestly. Long regard remained at the edge of erasure, a quiet testament to a species that had learned to stand where certainty ended without demanding resolution. Beneath a sky that measured not moments but epochs, humanity continued its long, unfinished answer, aware now that endurance was not survival alone, but the courage to remain adaptable in a universe that actively tested the right to exist. Time altered humanity more profoundly than any single revelation. As long regard held its vigil at the edge of erasure, and the construct continued its quiet resonance near the tier, human civilization entered an era defined less by discovery than by integration. The challenge was no longer to understand isolated phenomena, but to reconcile their collective implications without collapsing under their weight. Humanity had learned that the universe did not reward coherence achieved through simplification. It rewarded coherence achieved through accommodation. The most significant transformation occurred in how humanity conceived of identity. For millennia, identity had been anchored in biology, culture, or ideology. Now it expanded to include temporal posture. To be human increasingly meant to accept that one's actions were part of processes extending far beyond individual lifespans or even species continuity. This was not a surrender of agency, but an expansion of it. Decisions were framed not as endpoints, but as inflection points, and this framing permeated governance, art, science, and daily life. The continuity accords evolved accordingly. Where once they had coordinated between species and systems, they now incorporated temporal councils whose sole purpose was to model consequences across scales of time that no individual mind could intuit. These councils did not predict the future. They mapped possibility spaces, highlighting regions of fragility and resilience without prescribing paths. Their influence was advisory, but their existence altered discourse. Proposals that ignored long-horizon impacts were not rejected outright. They were simply understood as incomplete. Humanity's technological development mirrored this shift. Instead of pursuing maximal capability, engineers focused on graceful failure. Systems were designed to degrade informatively rather than catastrophically, to signal stress before collapse, to invite intervention rather than demand it. This philosophy extended even to artificial intelligences, whose architectures emphasized self-questioning loops that prevented premature convergence on optimal but brittle solutions. These intelligences did not seek certainty. They sought continued relevance. This approach proved vital when the anomaly's influence, though distant, began to manifest in subtle ways within human space. It did not advance like a wave. Instead, it appeared as localized absences of potential, regions where expected developments simply did not occur. Research stations reported experiments that refused to yield emergent results despite correct conditions. Cultural initiatives in certain habitats failed to generate novelty, their outputs echoing existing forms with uncanny fidelity. It was as if possibility itself had been thinned. Initial panic was restrained by memory. Humanity had learned not to mistake unfamiliar constraints for immediate doom. Investigations revealed that these zones correlated with areas of extreme optimization, where systems had been tuned so precisely that variability had been nearly eliminated. The anomaly did not need to arrive physically. Its pruning effect propagated along gradients of rigidity, finding resonance with structures that had inadvertently mirrored its own criteria. The response was not to dismantle these systems, but to reintroduce uncertainty. Randomized inputs were seeded into cultural, scientific, and economic processes, not chaos, but controlled unpredictability, enough to prevent collapse into sterile efficiency. The results were uneven but instructive. Some systems resisted, revealing hidden dependencies. Others flourished, producing outcomes that exceeded previous projections precisely because they could not be fully anticipated. Throughout this period, the construct remained a point of reference rather than command. Its simulations expanded, now including representations of the anomaly's long-term effects across cosmic history. Humanity observed that erasure did not target complexity itself, but complexity that could not absorb surprise. Civilizations that survived longest were those that institutionalized doubt, that embedded revision into their core narratives rather than treating it as failure. This realization forced humanity to confront a deeply rooted tension. Continuity required stability, but endurance required transformation. Balancing these imperatives demanded more than policy. It demanded a cultural acceptance that no version of humanity, however enlightened, was final. The most profound expression of this acceptance emerged in the transformation initiatives, voluntary programs that allowed individuals and communities to experiment with radical forms of existence. Some chose to alter their biology, embracing forms better suited to specific environments or cognitive tasks. Others merged partially with synthetic substrates, extending perception into dimensions inaccessible to unaugmented minds. Still others adopted cyclical identities, dissolving and reforming social structures on generational timescales to prevent ossification. These initiatives were controversial. Critics argued that humanity risked losing coherence, that fragmentation would invite vulnerability. Proponents countered that coherence enforced too tightly was indistinguishable from stagnation. The debate was intense, but notably non-violent, a testament to humanity's evolved capacity to hold opposing visions without immediate resolution. The watchers beyond the tier did not intervene. Their silence was not indifference. It was consistency. They had never dictated outcomes, only evaluated responses. Humanity's willingness to question its own continuity mechanisms was itself a response worth observing. Contact with Long Regard continued intermittently. Its crew, now spanning generations due to time dilation, reported deeper insights into the anomaly's nature. They observed that erasure was not uniformly destructive. In rare instances, it created conditions for entirely new forms of organization to arise in its wake, structures so alien that initial classification failed. These were not survivals of previous complexity, but emergences enabled by the removal of constraining frameworks. This revelation unsettled many. It suggested that erasure was not merely a filter, but a catalyst. The universe was not preserving complexity for its own sake. It was curating pathways for novelty that could not emerge within existing constraints. Humanity grappled with the ethical implications. If erasure enabled new forms of existence, was resistance always justified? Could there be circumstances where allowing dissolution was the more responsible choice? These questions had no easy answers, and humanity resisted the temptation to codify them prematurely. Instead, it adopted a principle of contextual humility. Resistance to erasure was appropriate when it preserved the capacity for future adaptation. Acceptance of erasure might be appropriate when existing structures actively prevented transformation. The challenge lay in discerning which was which without the benefit of hindsight. This principle was tested when a densely networked megastructure, home to billions and a hub of cultural production, began exhibiting signs of deep rigidity. Its governance systems, optimized for fairness and efficiency, had eliminated nearly all variance in outcome. Life within was comfortable, predictable, and increasingly devoid of surprise. Innovation had slowed to a crawl. Reports indicated rising existential malaise, not manifesting as unrest, but as quiet disengagement. Simulations suggested that the anomaly's pruning effect would eventually target the megastructure, not because of its scale, but because of its informational homogeneity. Humanity faced a harrowing choice. Intervene by forcibly restructuring the habitat systems, violating the autonomy of its inhabitants, or allow the possibility that erasure would dismantle it entirely, opening space for unknown futures. The inhabitants were consulted. In a series of assemblies unprecedented in scale, billions participated directly or through delegated cognition. The debate was raw, stripped of abstraction by proximity to consequence. Many argued for preservation, citing the lives, relationships, and histories embedded within the structure. Others argued that their very comfort had become a cage, that continuity without vitality was a form of slow disappearance. The final decision emerged not as consensus, but as consent. A narrow majority chose transformation over preservation. The megastructure systems were deliberately destabilized, introducing layers of uncertainty that dismantled rigid efficiencies. Governance shifted to experimental models. Resource distribution incorporated variability. Cultural programs prioritized risk and exploration. The transition was painful. Some left unwilling to trade certainty for possibility. Others stayed and struggled. Yet over time, signs of renewal appeared. New art forms emerged, unsettling and vibrant. Scientific inquiry regained its edge. The anomaly's influence receded, finding no resonance with a system once again capable of surprise. This episode marked a turning point. Humanity learned that resistance to erasure did not always mean clinging to form. Sometimes it meant relinquishing it. The construct responded with its most significant shift yet. A new simulation unfolded, depicting a future not fixed but branching, where humanity's continued existence was neither guaranteed nor denied. In some branches, humanity faded, its legacy diffused into successor forms beyond recognition. In others, it endured as a recognizable lineage, continually reshaped but traceable. The construct did not indicate preference. It displayed consequence. The message was clear. Humanity's measure was ongoing, not as a species seeking survival at all costs, but as a process seeking relevance within a dynamic universe. Endurance was not about being remembered. It was about remaining capable of participation. As centuries passed, humanity's relationship with the Watchers, the anomaly, and the broader cosmos settled into a pattern of attentive engagement. There were no final revelations, no culminating triumphs. There were only continued choices made with an awareness sharpened by long observation. Long regard remained at the edge of erasure, its crew now a living archive of adaptation. The tear persisted, a reminder of the first measurement. The construct endured, a lens through which humanity glimpsed its place in vast temporal currents. Humanity itself became something less singular and more resilient. It fractured, recombined, experimented, and remembered. It failed and learned. It accepted that some futures would be lost and others gained, and that this exchange was not a betrayal of continuity, but its expression. Under a sky that did not promise mercy or meaning, humanity chose to continue, not by insisting on its permanence, but by honoring the unfinished nature of its existence. In doing so, it aligned not with a single vision of survival, but with the deeper rhythm of a universe that tested not strength alone, but the capacity to change without surrendering the will to endure. Humanity eventually understood that there would be no final chapter written by the universe on its behalf. No culmination where the Watchers withdrew in approval, no moment when the anomaly resolved into explanation, no era where continuity became secure enough to rest upon. The measure was not a ladder with a final rung. It was a horizon that receded as understanding advanced, and the only failure was to stop walking toward it. As millennia unfolded, the concept of humanity stretched until it could no longer be confined to origin or form. There were still baseline humans, biologically close to their ancestors, living on planets where sky and soil remained meaningful. There were also those who existed as distributed processes across light years, their consciousness braided through computation, ecology, and social pattern. Some communities chose deliberate ephemerality, forming with the intention of dissolving within a few generations, so their ideas could seed elsewhere without calcifying. Others pursued continuity of lineage, maintaining unbroken cultural threads that reached back to the first days beneath Earth's sun. None of these paths was considered more authentic than another. Authenticity itself had been redefined. To be human was no longer a matter of shape or memory, but of participation in the shared ethic that had emerged through measurement and response. The commitment to remain adaptable without abandoning responsibility, to pursue survival without mistaking it for supremacy. The watchers beyond the tier remained, though even their nature grew less distinct over time. Humanity's increasing capacity to perceive probability gradients and deep structural patterns revealed that the watchers were not singular entities, but convergences of process, civilizations that had once been discrete and had learned, through cycles of erasure and persistence, to merge into evaluative continua. They were not immortal in the conventional sense. They were sustained by relevance, dissolving portions of themselves that no longer adapted, incorporating new structures when alignment emerged. This revelation did not diminish them, it contextualized them. Humanity realized that the watchers themselves were subject to the same universal filters. Their policy of evaluation was not authority handed down from a higher plane, but a survival strategy refined across epochs. They watched because watching allowed calibration. They intervened sparingly because excessive control produced brittleness. They had endured not by ruling the cosmos, but by learning when to let go. The anomaly, too, was reinterpreted. Longregard's descendants, now entities whose identities blended vessel, crew, and environment, transmitted insights that reframed erasure as an emergent regulatory phenomenon rather than an external threat. The universe, vast beyond intuition, generated complexity freely, but not indiscriminately. When complexity became self-limiting, incapable of absorbing novelty, erasure prevented stagnation from dominating the cosmic landscape. This understanding did not make erasure benign, it made it inevitable. And inevitability, humanity had learned, was not the same as futility. Armed with this perspective, humanity ceased asking how to defeat erasure and began asking how to dance with it. Systems were designed with intentional lifespans, structures meant to collapse gracefully into components that could seed future forms. Knowledge preservation shifted away from static archives toward living traditions that evolved as they were transmitted. Even memory became adaptive, with some histories allowed to fade so that others could be reinterpreted without being shackled to outdated frameworks. There were losses. Entire modes of existence vanished when they could no longer justify their own inertia. Some lamented these disappearances, seeing in them the echoes of ancient extinctions, but humanity no longer interpreted loss solely as failure. It learned to distinguish between destruction that impoverished the future and dissolution that enriched it. The most significant test of this philosophy arrived when the tier itself began to change. After eons of stability, subtle fluctuations appeared along its boundary. The construct's resonances shifted erratically, its simulations fragmenting into overlapping futures that refused to converge. Humanity's instruments detected increasing tension between the tier's internal geometry and the surrounding spacetime, as if two incompatible narratives of reality were pressing against one another. Longregard's far observers confirmed what humanity feared and anticipated in equal measure. The tier was not permanent. It was a bridge sustained by alignment, and that alignment was evolving. The watchers were changing, not collapsing, but transforming in ways that would render the tier obsolete. Soon, the structure that had first acknowledged humanity would no longer be accessible in its current form. Panic did not follow. Grief did, tempered by understanding. Humanity convened its most inclusive deliberation in history. Every form of participation, from individual minds to distributed intelligences and emergent collectives, was invited. The question was not how to preserve the tier, but how to respond to its impending departure. Some argued for intervention, proposing technologies that might stabilize the tier against change. Simulations showed that such efforts could succeed temporarily, but only by freezing both sides into mutual rigidity, inviting eventual catastrophic erasure. Others argued for abandonment, claiming that humanity had already gained what it needed and should now stand alone. A third path emerged, echoing the lessons of the megastructure and the anomaly. Humanity could let the tier transform, but not without contribution. It could imprint upon the transition not control, but character. The proposal was radical. Humanity would encode into the tier a record not of its achievements, but of its process. Not monuments or technologies, but patterns of decision-making, of failure and revision, of restraint exercised and risks embraced. This encoding would not be a message in language or symbol, but a structural influence, shaping how the tier resolved as it dissolved into whatever followed. The Watchers did not forbid this. They did not endorse it. They observed. The undertaking spanned millennia. Contributions came from all facets of humanity and its allied continuities. Stories of collapse survived alongside stories of renewal. Contradictions were preserved rather than smoothed away. The encoding emphasized unfinishedness, the refusal to claim final answers even when solutions worked. As the process neared completion, the construct simulations began to stabilize, not around a single future, but around a spectrum that shared one trait: permeability. Whatever followed the tier would not be a closed, evaluative system. It would be open to influence, not dominion, by emergent participants who demonstrated the same alignment humanity had once struggled to articulate. When the transformation occurred, it was not an explosion or a disappearance. The tier softened, its sharp impossibilities resolving into gradients. The construct unraveled into filaments of influence that diffused throughout spacetime, no longer anchored to a single location. The Watchers, as they had been known, ceased to exist as discrete observers. Their evaluative function persisted, but distributed, embedded into the universe's ongoing processes rather than standing apart from them. Humanity felt the change not as loss, but as responsibility settling more fully upon its shoulders. There was no longer an external witness to sharpen accountability. The sky did not watch in the way it once had. Instead, humanity understood that it had become part of the watching, one of many processes contributing to how the universe evaluated itself over time. This did not elevate humanity above others, it bound it more deeply to consequence. Long regard finally departed the edge of erasure, its purpose fulfilled not by conquering the anomaly, but by integrating its lessons. Its descendants dispersed, seeding regions of space where adaptability was still nascent, carrying with them no doctrine, only example. The anomaly continued its work, pruning where rigidity accumulated, enabling novelty where dissolution cleared space. Humanity no longer perceived it as enemy or ally, it was context. Across epochs so vast that stars were born and died between recorded thoughts, humanity persisted, though never unchanged. Sometimes it faded almost entirely, reduced to scattered continuities clinging to marginal niches. Sometimes it flourished, its influence shaping vast regions of cosmic process. There was no guaranteed arc upward, only a sustained refusal to collapse into static form. In the end, if such a term could apply, humanity was not remembered as a species that dominated the universe or unlocked its secrets. It was remembered, where memory persisted at all, as a pattern that learned how to be measured without hardening, how to endure without insisting on permanence, how to change without surrendering the will to continue. Beneath an unyielding sky that neither promised nor denied meaning, humanity chose again and again to participate honestly in existence. That choice, repeated across forms and eras, was never complete, never secure, and never finished. And that was enough.